Did you know that in the 17th century, people used to believe that bathing would lead to sickness? This led to widespread sickness as individuals went weeks or even months without bathing. Doctors even recommended that women who wanted to conceive should drink a potion made from crushed beetles.
You think of a palace, and you imagine the glamour, the ornate decoration, and the alluring fragrance it exudes. But today, I welcome you to the court of King Louis XIV at Versailles.
Louis took the trend for perfumery to new heights by commissioning his perfumer to create a new scent for each day of the week.
Though renowned for its luxury, it is infamous for its stench. No amount of gold or glory could mask it. Just a spoiler. Women pulled up their skirts to pee where they stood while some men urinated off the balustrade in the middle of the royal chapel. I'm sure you are curious to find out more. Sit tight, and let's dive into the story. Hygiene in the 17th century. Before we judge the book by its cover, let's uncover the book. Let's take a quick dive into the hygiene of the 17th century. Many of us in the Western world now have the luxury of bathing or showering daily and then applying antiperspirants and perfume. Many of us now know germs are easily transferable from what you touch to your body. Naturally, people like to wash their hands with soap and water to reduce the chances of getting sick, and many people use hand wipes, alcohol pads, and more to get rid of dirt and germs. That wasn't the case in the 1600s. This was a time of lice, fleas, intestinal worms, and yes, plague and pestilence. People were not aware that the disease was spread by germs which thrived on dirt. They did not think of washing their hands before eating or cleaning the streets, so diseases could spread quickly. Contrary to what most people see today, people in the 17th century did not consider hot water to be a pleasant or hygienic necessity. Many even believed that bathing in hot water was bad for health. According to historian Louis Harper, there was a belief that warm water could weaken the body by dilating the pores, allowing diseases to penetrate. Not only in France, but across Europe, people considered it safer and more beneficial for health to wash themselves quickly rather than bathe in a tub. Take England's 17th century hygiene, for example. In Emily Cockaine's excellent Hubbub, Filth, Noise, and Stench in England, page 60, we learn that people, such as Samuel Pepys, rubbed himself clean. This does not mean he washed and lathered himself up with soap and rinsed. No, it meant he had a cloth or rag that may or may not have been wet, wrung it out, and then rubbed it against his body. But this dirty boy, Pepys, soon got in trouble with his wife, Elizabeth, as a result of being unclean since she had gone to a public bathhouse and was rightly fed up with him being smelly. So Elizabeth refused to let him into the marriage bed until he had washed. After holding out for 3 days, he finally relented and bathed in hot water. In fact, another physician by the name of Thomas Cogan recommended, "Wash your face and hands with clean cold water, and especially bathe and plunge the eyes therein, for that not only cleanseth away the filth, but also comforteth and greatly preserveth the sight." Nice soap was too expensive for most folks back then. Additionally, the Western Europeans believed that immersing the entire body in water was not healthy. So during winter, when there was no hot water, a person would only clean their hands and face daily if possible. Some people, uncomfortable with being dirty or smelling bad, would wash themselves in a river or stream. In such circumstances, pleasant smells were very welcome. In Gervais Markham's popular 17th century work, The English Housewife, he writes about making pomanders, which you could carry around and sniff if there was a particularly foul stench. Although neat freak Henry VIII bathed often and changed his undershirts daily, he was a royal rarity. Queen Isabella of Castile bathed twice in her lifetime, Herman says. Marie Antoinette bathed once a month. The 17th century British King James I was said to never bathe, causing the rooms he frequented to be filled with lice. Louis himself was no exception to the no-bath lifestyle. Historians assume that the so-called Sun King only took 2 baths throughout his life. you could expect that Versailles' hygiene itself was très mal. But before we dive into Versailles' hygiene, let me tell you about King Louis and his beloved Versailles court. Keep watching. King Louis XIV and Versailles Palace. Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, reigned over France longer than any other known European sovereign for 72 years. Born on September 5, 1638, to King Louis XIII of France and his Habsburg queen, Anne of Austria, the future Louis XIV was his parents' first child after 23 years of marriage. In recognition of this apparent miracle, he was christened Louis Dieudonné, meaning gift of God. Louis XIV chose the sun as his emblem and cultivated the image of an omniscient and infallible Roi Soleil, Sun King, around whom the entire realm orbited. While some historians question the attribution, Louis is often remembered for the bold and infamous statement, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state. He also moved his royal court to Versailles in 1682. Though it had originally been a hunting lodge, Louis expanded and remodeled Versailles to become a glittering palace worthy of his status as the Sun King. For those who think his Versailles palace is a small place, let me give you an insight into what it looks like. The Palace of Versailles is known for its opulent rooms, extravagant gardens, and the integral role it played in the French Revolution. Every year, more than 3 million visitors tour the palace. A few of the biggest draws at the palace are the Hall of Mirrors, the Chapelle Royale, and the Salon de Venus. The grounds feature priceless works of art, period furniture, and statues. For outdoor lovers, there are numerous plants, flowers, fountains, and statues to admire while strolling through the lush gardens on the property. Like other opulent and historically significant structures such as the Taj Mahal, Versailles' architectural history is filled with interesting anecdotes, such as the time all of its mirror makers were killed for doing their job too well. There are many stories about the building of Versailles and the immense amount of money and labor it took to create such an elaborate structure. Dating back to the 17th century, Versailles is located about 12 miles from Paris. You can imagine how much time and effort it took to create the massive palace, which became the envy of many foreign visitors from the 1600s up until today. In fact, the palace became a symbol of wealth and excess, though its hygiene left something to be desired. To tell you how big it is, the palace could accommodate over 5,000 people between its walls, and that's a lot of mouths to feed. In order to serve meals to so many people, the kitchens at the palace were enormous. Hundreds of servants attended to them alone. Also, Louis XIV's bedroom was considered the most important room in the palace. Two very important events took place there each day. He would wake up and go to sleep surrounded by courtiers. There were also special ceremonies for putting on and removing his boots. During his reign, he transformed the monarchy, ushered in a golden age of art and literature, presided over a dazzling royal court at Versailles, annexed key territories, and established his country as the dominant European power. In administration, Louis also managed to pacify and disempower the historically rebellious nobles, who had fomented no fewer than 11 civil wars in 4 decades by luring them to his court and habituating them to the opulent lifestyle there. French aristocrats were expected to live at Versailles, which, in the long run, contributed to the messiness of the court. To put it in context, Versailles became a small town that accommodated about 5,000 inhabitants. The corridors and staircases were bustling with activity, and sometimes even cows, which had been brought into the palace to provide fresh milk for small children, would walk around. The cattle took up quite a lot of space, but the palace's sedan chairs took the crown. The palace had taxi companies that carried members of the royal family through the endlessly long hallways, so the royals wouldn't have to soil their shoes on the excrement lying around in the corridors. Despite the fact that only the royal family was allowed to be lugged around in private sedan chairs, this taxi service was so eagerly used that long queues formed in the hallways. After dark, The bearers were constantly colliding with each other because torches were the only source of light available. Later in the evening, once traffic calmed down, the corridors were filled with the voices of people who got lost and the clatter of people peeing in a corner. It was against this awe-inspiring backdrop that Louis tamed the nobility and impressed foreign dignitaries, using entertainment, ceremony, and a highly codified system of etiquette to assert his supremacy. In fact, did you know that at the Palace of Versailles, aristocrats were expected to compete for the privilege of watching Louis XIV wake up, eat meals, and prepare for bed? But for those who were actually there, Versailles was most memorable for something considerably less opulent: the persistent stench that permeated the entire grounds. At times, over 10,000 royals, aristocrats, government officials, servants, and military officers lived in Versailles and its surrounding lodgings. Despite its reputation for magnificence, life at Versailles, for both royals and servants, was no cleaner than the slum-like conditions in many European cities at the time. What was hygiene like in the Versailles court? Let's find out. Clothing and cleanliness. Now, as we established, Louis XIV wasn't too fond of bathing or showering. This is not to say that he never cared about his personal hygiene. It is known that he occasionally wiped himself with a towel, scrubbed his body with perfume and alcohol, and washed his hands every morning. His servants would wash the king with a liquid called aquavit, which was ethanol consisting of about 90% alcohol. Only the king's face received a splash of cold water, but this daily cleaning routine did not help at all against the king's bad breath and sweaty smell. The lucky few who were allowed to get really close to Louis XIV reported that the foul smell that hung in the palace was only surpassed by the body odor of the Sun King himself. According to a Russian ambassador, he had an odor reminiscent of the stench of a wild animal. Like almost everyone else in the 17th century, the Sun King was afraid to bathe in warm water. When he started to sweat, he simply changed his shirt. Louis and his courtiers changed their shirts several times a day, signaling both their wealth and status. But sitting next to any of them at dinner wouldn't have been easy on the olfactory senses. Though in a bid to conceal his thinning hair, Louis XIV helped popularize wigs in France. But the wigs had another effect. Lice often infested them instead of a person's scalp. Boiling a lice-covered wig was an easier way to control an infestation than picking the lice out of hair. Wigs were doused with fragrances, often in the form of pomades, but this did nothing to combat lice and other insects that would infest the headpieces. Ironically, the adoption of wigs took place in reaction to lice that infested one's natural hair. During the mid-17th century, men and women shaved their heads to rid themselves of bugs, only to find new critters in their artificial coifs. Furthermore, by all accounts, Versailles was epically stinky. As one witness described, the unpleasant odors in the park, gardens, even the chateau, make one's gorge rise. The communicating passages, courtyards, buildings in the wings, and corridors are full of urine and feces. A pork butcher actually sticks and roasts his pigs at the bottom of the minister's wing every morning. The Avenue Saint-Cloud is covered with stagnant water and dead cats. So what did courtiers do to counteract the stomach-churning smells that filled the air? They doused themselves with perfume. As historian Alain Corbin put it, to use excessive amounts of perfume was to protect oneself and to purify the surrounding air. But the prevalence of perfumes only made things worse, since it added yet another fragrance to the already unbearable stench. Sadly for all involved, underarm deodorants wouldn't be widely used until the 20th century. Although perfumes could mask unpleasant odors, body odor was still a big problem. How did they relieve themselves? Let's find out. Toilets and waste management at Versailles. In modern times, answering nature's call is typically a private experience, but that wasn't always the case at Versailles. For Louis XIV, for example, he often met visitors while sitting on a portable toilet, as did other members of his court. Louis obligated his courtiers to pretend not to hear the sounds that accompanied Louis's visit to the chair. It kind of gives a whole new meaning to doing your business. Despite the unnecessary openness, all the inhabitants had chamber pots or commodes in their private rooms. The higher the rank at court, the more likely they were to have a small toilet in their chambers. The first water-flushing toilet was not introduced until Louis XV, the Sun King's successor, installed one for his personal use in 1738. However, given the large number of people on the property, the supply of toilets was, to say the least, insufficient. Due to the small number of toilets and high demand, the latrines were heavily used and often overflowed, and sewage penetrated through the walls and floors into neighboring rooms. The blockages and corrosion in the palace's iron and lead pipes were known to occasionally poison everything in Marie Antoinette's kitchen. These hygienic conditions at Versailles impacted the palace's food, making life difficult for the palace's cooks. Though hand-washing was part of Louis XIV's dining ritual, there is evidence that food was not always prepared or handled properly. As a result, intestinal parasites lived within courtiers at Versailles. Even the king wasn't spared. He had several bouts of tapeworm. During one bout, Louis XIV is said to have relieved himself of a worm that was nearly 6 inches long. Not even the rooms of the royal children were safe, according to historian Tony Spawforth. An occasional court exodus could have reduced the wear and tear on Versailles, perhaps leading to fewer unpleasant structural failures. Furthermore, at Versailles there were only a few sanitary facilities, so chamber pots were often unceremoniously thrown out of windows. Passers-by had to move carefully. If the pots were not thrown out, the contents had to be taken to one of the nearby cesspools where the waste was collected. According to Tony Spawforth, author of Versailles, A Biography of a Palace, Marie Antoinette was once hit by human waste being thrown out of a window as she walked through an interior courtyard. For peasants, a toilet was a bucket in the corner of the room that was tossed into the river, or a bucket behind the house, or a tree in the forest. No privies for these folks. Seeing someone in the act of relieving themselves wasn't an uncommon sight. Unfortunately, water for cooking and bathing came from the same river. Perhaps this is why they thought bathing could make them ill. The Princess d'Harcourt, for one, didn't even think twice about urinating in public. In 1702, German-born Princess Elizabeth Charlotte recoiled at the behavior she saw at the French court. The people stationed in the galleries in front of our room piss in all the corners. It is impossible to leave one's apartment without seeing somebody pissing. Louis XIV finally ordered that the servants clean up the garbage weekly, but from what one hears, the stench at Versailles was horrible and overwhelming. According to an eyewitness, the unpleasant smells in the park, gardens, and even in the castle could literally make a person choke. In fact, any visitor to Versailles would have seen domestic and feral cats throughout the palace estate, and some court members brought pets. While the heaps of food waste attracted rodents, the cats were attracted to hunt them. So, the presence of so many cats led to even more sanitary problems. Feline excrement could be spotted all over the grounds. Worse, the remains of deceased cats could be found along the town's main thoroughfare, with Avenue de Saint-Cloud covered with stagnant water and dead cats. This unsanitary way of living no doubt led to countless deaths throughout royal European households. It was not until the 19th century that standards of cleanliness and technological developments improved life for many people, including members of royal courts. Today, many European royals still move from residence to residence, but for pleasure, not to outrun squalor. So, how did the courtiers deal with the smell? Keep watching to find out. Perfume as a solution. They tried to cover the stench with perfume. Most of the inhabitants routinely doused themselves with generous amounts of it. Historian Alain Cabin puts it this way: the excessive use of perfumes served to protect oneself from the ambient air. But this was ultimately counterproductive, because the proliferation of perfume only made things worse, intensifying the already intolerable stench. Making matters worse exponentially was the fact that Louis generally stayed put at Versailles rather than circulating between multiple palaces as kings had previously done. This put an impossible housekeeping burden on the army of servants and caretakers, who simply couldn't keep up with the mountains of filth and waste that courtiers produced, but resorted to perfume. Despite how famous it is today, Versailles was never really an obvious location for a royal court. Initially built as a hunting lodge, it wasn't near flowing water, which could whisk away waste. Worse, the site was built on what one observer called shifting sand and marsh. So, when Louis XIV decided to move his court there, the already poor hygienic situation at Versailles quickly deteriorated as more people descended on the space. Even Louis was addicted to perfumers. At his request, the royal perfumer was always making new scents. Louis had a perfume for each day of the week and had his clothes washed in a mixture of rose water, jasmine, and musk. During the later years of his life, the king used less perfume and at one point stopped using it altogether, after which he banned the use of perfume by other courtiers as well. Quite possibly, the overuse had made him allergic to the ingredients used in many perfumes. Apparently, the foul body odor was the only problem that affected his later years. He has bad breath and has also become toothless. How did that happen? Let's find out. Louis Dental problem. The bad breath led Madame de Montespan, a mistress to King Louis XIV, to use large amounts of perfume in hopes of avoiding the royal's halitosis. In fact, by the time he passed away, Louis XIV was toothless due to a lifetime of dental problems. His dental issues were not uncommon. The availability of refined sugar in France in the 17th century, a result of colonialism and slavery, led to dental decay among the French aristocrats who indulged in decadent, sugary treats. Despite the prevalence of tooth decay, having a good mouth was crucial for many courtiers at Versailles and aligned with their beauty standards. According to the 17th century text, The School of Venus, a beautiful woman was expected to have even and very white teeth. Courtiers used various powders and mouthwashes to create the appearance of healthy teeth. By the mid-18th century, oral hygiene had become a symbol of elegance, partly due to advancements in dentistry. But have you wondered why people still continue living in such a horrible mess? Let me tell you about how the Sun King was able to keep the palace a center of attraction despite the stench. Keep watching. The reason why people stayed. The unpleasant odor at Versailles was widely known and considered worse than that of other European palaces at the time. This was due to the large scale of everything at the French court, including the number of people who lived there. However, living in close proximity to the king offered aristocrats the best chance of securing prestigious positions or titles. As a result, courtiers who held positions at Versailles stayed for as long as possible. Even a small, malodorous room at Versailles was considered more prestigious than any other residence in France. Therefore, the nobility endured the presence of rats and mice that ruined their clothes, as well as extreme temperatures ranging from freezing in winter to sweltering in summer. Over time, the residents became accustomed to the smell. Most of them no longer noticed it, and the nobles didn't mind, as they were pleased to hold a position near the king at court. Another reason many stayed was the vibrant social life within and around the palace. Versailles wasn't just the seat of royal authority in France. It was also a hotbed of liaisons among all classes. After Louis XIV moved his court to Versailles, workers and nobles alike descended on the town. The forest surrounding the palace grounds became a kind of open-air brothel, where SX workers could be solicited. In response to what he considered the immoral licentiousness of his court and kingdom, Louis vigorously policed SX workers and labeled them as sinners. However, despite his public stance on morality, Louis maintained numerous mistresses. Tapeworms were foodborne, but syphilis, a disease that afflicted half of the royal court during the reign of Louis XIV, was transmitted through sexual contact as a result of their escapade. Fashion trends in those days often originated at the palace. For example, the color known as puce, a reddish purple-brown shade, got its name at Versailles in 1775 when Marie Antoinette wore a gown in that color. Her husband, Louis XVI, compared the shade to une puce, meaning a flea, which led to the name. Despite the comparison, the color became popular at court, with every lady wearing a puce-colored gown. Additionally, after the birth of Louis XVI's heir in 1781, courtiers celebrated by wearing a new color called caca dauphin, or dauphin poop, due to its resemblance to the infant's excrement. How did the Sun King die, and did the palace continue in such a state of mess? Let's find out. Louis XIV's death and improvements under Louis XV. On September 1st, 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday, Louis XIV died of gangrene at Versailles. His reign had lasted 72 years, longer than any other known European monarch, and left an indelible mark on France's culture, history, and destiny. His 5-year-old great-grandson succeeded him as Louis XV. After Louis XIV passed in 1715, his 5-year-old great-grandson inherited the throne as Louis XV. Recognizing the palace's unhygienic and generally stinky state, Louis XV initiated several renovation projects to clean things up. Chief among them was extending the sewage pipes, which put a greater distance between the palace and its cesspools of human waste, a much-needed improvement. To be fair, King Louis XV and Marie Antoinette, wife of the late king, did take warm baths, benefiting from revamped plumbing through the course of the 18th century. Bidets and even a flush toilet provided King Louis XV with a level of convenience unknown to his predecessors. Even with those changes, visitors to Versailles noted, "The unpleasant odors in the park, gardens, even the chateau, make one's gorge rise. The communicating passages, buildings in the wings, and corridors are full of urine and feces. This was the result of human and animal waste, stagnant water, and dead animals." Outro. If you had been present in the Versailles Palace, how would you have coped? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Do well to like this video and subscribe to this channel to get notified whenever we drop inspiring and entertaining content like this. Thank you for watching and check out our other videos.